All right, well, hello everybody. I'm going to not belabor this because I know I stand between you and dinner and cocktails or whatever you're doing. I hope you had a really good day so far. And I'm pleased to be part of this and provide you some information about UMail, and specifically UMail Protective Services and what we do to help CPaaS providers as well as the remainder of the VoIP ecosystem protect themselves from unwanted robocalls, in particular the unlawful variety. So you've probably seen the agenda already, just sharing that with you for now so you can glance at that. But perhaps what I should do is just jump ahead just a little bit here, just to give you a little bit of context about UMail and UMail Protective Services. So UMail itself goes back to 2007, starting off as a OTT app provider with really just a visual voicemail app, which at the time was relatively novel because otherwise you had to use your carrier's voicemail and it wasn't visual. You had to just listen to it. You didn't get transcription. So fast forward probably about 8 years or so, we realized that we had to do something about the robocall problem. It wasn't going away. We had to minimally protect our own app users. So we did that, as I said, probably about 8 years after we launched the company. But then more recently, a couple years ago, we realized that since we're doing this for our own app users, which tend to be on the B2C side, consumers or small to medium-sized businesses, we realized that we've got this data, and why not make it available for the communication service provider ecosystem, as well as enterprise. So there enters UMail Protective Services, which is not a separate company. It's really more like a separate division of UMail for B2B services. So just to give you that context, and let's jump right in. So there's many different types of unwanted calls and ostensibly illegal calls. Some of them are outright scams, like the couple that are on top, and others are unlawful for other reasons. They're not necessarily a scam per se from a commerce perspective, but they're unlawful from a telemarketing perspective. And here is an example of an unlawful call. Now, if we look at this from the bottom up, from a fraud perspective, they are referencing Microsoft. It's not overt fraud in the sense that they're not saying that they are Microsoft, and we do see those, by the way, at UMail. In this case, it could be fraud from the implication of it being an association that's not merited, that's unsubstantiated, because they're implying that they know something about you, they're implying that they know that you have Windows, et cetera, et cetera. From an unlawful perspective, we take into consideration that type of fraud, brand impersonation, or some unsubstantiated association. But we also look at things like the Federal Trade Commission's telemarketing sales rule. I've got a hyperlink there so that if you want to click on that later, you can check that out. But one of the things that they say is that you must self-identify, which they sort of do here. They don't say that I'm calling from Microsoft, but they sort of identify, inferring that they're associated with Microsoft. But what they don't do is provide a callback number. And that's one of the things that telemarketing sales rule says that you must do. By virtue of this having a relatively high fraud score and a very high unlawful score, it's very spammy. But also you can have spam for other reasons. One of the things that happens with spam is that the algorithms, UMail's included, are heavily weighted based on crowdsourced feedback. And spam being a highly subjective thing, it's not uncommon for the spam score to be weighted heavily based on the fact that people just don't want to receive these kinds of calls. In this case, it's downright unlawful, so they definitely don't want to receive it. So what's happening here in the ecosystem? What's happening is that you've got some bad actors out there. Sometimes they're coming through international gateways, sometimes they're coming from a domestic origination. And you've got companies out there like UMail that are protecting at the intermediate network level. So we have customers that are transiting calls. They're not originating or terminating, they're just transiting. And to the extent that those customers use the UMail services, we are facilitating stopping these unlawful calls from ever reaching a terminating carrier. But for terminating carriers that do receive these calls, they can also be protected by UMail and others as well. You're probably familiar with some of them. First Orion, Paya, and TNS for T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon respectively are a few good examples. So what's working, what's not? So Stir Shaken is definitely helping to some degree. For example, I'm a Verizon customer. I actually called myself apparently once a couple years ago. I say that as a pun because of course it was a bad actor calling me, which is really confusing because I was on a call at the time and I thought maybe I butt dialed myself, but then I realized that didn't make any sense. So those kind of calls don't happen anymore thanks to Stir Shaken. But there are of course holes where there's TDM SS7, the token's not passed. So even though from a Stir perspective, the attestation level may be set at B or A, but if you can't pass the token, then when it gets to the Shaken part, then it kind of looks like an unsigned call, and then they might assign it a C attestation. So it's just unfortunate that there's holes in place. The FCC has an NPRM that's looking for comments on out-of-band Stir Shaken solutions, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But I would say that by and large, our biggest problem is not even the holes in Stir Shaken, it's really what I refer to as the least number problem. And the way this works is either a large wholesale VoIP service provider, or perhaps more germane to this presentation, a CPaaS provider will either lease out their own numbers and or allow an entity to bring their own numbers. And sadly, what happens sometimes is those numbers are abused in the former, or they're just playing dirty in the latter. So there are ways to deal with that from a real-time perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, to the extent that UMail provides these kind of services to intermediate network operators, those calls can be blocked before they ever reach a consumer. However, there's definitely better ways to deal with that. And one of the diagrams that I like to refer to is this one, where in the top I've got Stir Shaken, but you could replace that with an alternative authentication and validation solution, but by and large we're looking at Stir Shaken because that's what has been mandated and what's being deployed. Know your customer is also very important, KYC. But that third component in the lower left, monitoring, that's where UMail comes in. It could be UMail, it could be anybody else. I'm advocating UMail, not just because I work for them, but also we've got a very unique solution in the sense that we're using content-based analytics. We're actually looking at the payload in the form of the pre-recorded audio left behind as a voicemail to our consumers. That's our sensor network that we use. And what we do is we apply AI machine learning to discern first whether an audio is a robocall, and then if so, then we augment with human intelligence to determine whether it's the legal ethical variety like public safety, or if not, then we will categorize it, such as the Social Security Administration scam, or if there's some kind of brand mention like Amazon. Sometimes we need to vet to make sure it's not really Amazon. Sometimes it's intuitively obvious that it's not Amazon. We will apply score, as I mentioned earlier. We will apply digital fingerprint so we can track that particular campaign when it comes through, which is really helpful because numbers are constantly changing. One of the major industry problems actually is what I refer to as the one and done issue, where bad actors and even good guys are sometimes using a number once, placing a call, and then moving on to the next number, which makes it extremely difficult. So one of the things that we do to help deal with that is apply digital fingerprint so we can at least identify the campaign that comes through, even if it's a different number, which helps us from a scoring perspective to make sure that we identify that a particular number is associated with a unwanted campaign very quickly. So, next diagram. Where these circles meet is what we really need to think about. Because from a know your customer perspective, for example, in the bottom there, you can know your customer, but you can't really know how your customers are going to behave until they start behaving. One of our CPaaS customers actually uses our solution as part of their onboarding, because what they do is they allow customers to bring their own numbers, and what they'll do as part of their KYC process and onboarding is they will use, it's referred to as our watch solution, I'll go over that in a minute. They will look at the numbers to see how healthy they are, see if there's any issues or concerns with them, And if they're really bad, they might not even use them, they might not even allow them as a customer. If they're marginal concerns, what they'll do is they'll just monitor them really closely, and if their numbers are completely green, then great. Then no problems or issues. They don't have to do anything with that. But I would advocate that you really need all three of these things, and it's kind of that dark purple in the center. Using STIR/SHAKEN, having a very robust KYC process, and using some form of telephone number-based behavior monitoring is very, very important, and you really need all three to ensure that you're going to minimize or even completely reduce the incidence of unlawful calls. So, scenarios for CPaaS providers. These are the questions to be asked. Do your customers use your DIDs? Do you have a CPaaS platform where your customers are using your DIDs or your toll-free numbers, your TFNs? And by definition, that's one of the things that CPaaS providers do, so it's likely that the answer is yes. Or that second example that I gave just a moment ago, do they bring their own numbers? And then if so, then it probably is a good idea to have some kind of a monitoring solution. So I'm going to talk about two different solutions to use to protect CPaaS platforms and your services. One of them is Watch, which I mentioned just a moment ago, and the other one is Score. So what we do is when we categorize these calls, and I gave an example earlier where I had those check marks, we look at fraud, we look at unlawful, and we look at spam. And so we will provide a score for each one. We picked 0.8 as the threshold for where we recommend blocking to occur if we score a particular DID or TFN toll-free number as fraudulent. So in other words, if we're looking at a particular number and we scored a 0.8, most likely an intermediate network operator that's using our service is going to block that. Same is true for unlawful. If it's fraudulent or if it's unlawful for other reasons, such as violating state statutes, maybe they're calling too early or too late, or maybe they're violating the telemarketing sales rule, then we'll score that 0.8. Spam score, we don't recommend blocking on that. Just because something is considered spammy does not really should not be prudent to block that as a result of that. So we don't advocate that happening. The way this works from a technical perspective, we have an API which can either be queried on a per call basis. It's a REST-based API, by the way, or we have a version of it that can be cached. You get an update via the REST API for the entire database, and then the sweet spot tends to be every 15 minutes to get updates so that you can continue to have the most up-to-date version in your local cache. And typically the way that works is it's integration at the session border controller level or a soft switch where you're effectively updating the routing tables so that when you see a call come in, you know to let it go as normal or to provide some form of alternative treatment, which could be blocking the call, letting it fall on the floor. If it's a terminating use case scenario, you might want to divert to an IVR or perhaps some kind of challenge. And we have some call center, BPO type customers that do that, some IP, PBX customers as well. Because in a terminating scenario, you can do that. You don't need to worry about latency so much. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead here now to the Watch solution. This is what I was mentioning earlier. This is not intended to be a real-time solution like Score. Instead, this is intended to be something that's used to identify the health of your numbers or the numbers that are brought to you, as I was mentioning. And again, what we're doing is we're looking at the behaviors of the numbers, which is not exactly the same thing as reputation. One of the big things that's going on in the industry right now is a lot of numbers are getting a suboptimal reputation. And what we believe is happening because of this one and done scenario that I talked about earlier, many of the other analytics engines that do call labeling, we don't do call labeling, by the way, but many of those that do, we believe what they're doing is they're erring on the side of extreme conservatism because there's so many numbers that have never before been seen or used, and they are automatically labeling them as a nuisance call. But those other analytics engines, they use an event-based analytics approach. They're looking at the the number of SIP messages, the frequency of SIP messages. Is it a number that's ever been seen before? Are they calling a number that's on the do not call list, et cetera, et cetera. They're not looking at the actual payload. In contrast, looking at the payload, we can come up with some really interesting determinations. And I'm just going to skip ahead to the next slide, because I think actually this one makes more sense. Here's an actual example of what we saw. I redacted the name of the company, but this was a legitimate bank that was making calls. And we actually had one of our customers call and complain to us, because this was a customer's customer situation. Our direct customer called and said, "Hey, Jerry, why are you blocking this particular customer? It's a bank. We know they're legit. We know they're not doing anything wrong." So we checked to see what was going on. We found out that it was not a spoof situation. We do see those still, by the way, because of STIR/SHAKEN not being ubiquitous and the problem that I mentioned earlier about losing tokens and TDM SS7 holes. In this case, it was in fact the bank that was placing the calls, but, and I remember this vividly, it was on April 1st and April 4th of this year, these three campaigns that you see here, they mentioned the name of the bank, but they did not provide a valid callback number. So we marked them as 0.8 blockable from an unlawful perspective. They were not fraudulent. They mentioned the bank. It really was the bank, and that was no problem. But so what we did from a remediation perspective is we told our customer, who in turn told their customer, and they got it fixed. It may have been a junior level person that wasn't following the rules. They didn't realize they had to provide a valid callback number. So the bottom line is we very expeditiously caught this, we're informative, and it got remediated, it got fixed. So this is actually one of the really good use cases for using this type of solution. It's this bottom one here. I refer to it as DID or TFN owner or user governance, where spoofing hasn't occurred, it's not an outright scam, but instead you're just not following rules, so we can very quickly let you know. Another use case, the one on top, is spoofing. Another real world example, another customer's customer example. We had a customer call us and very similar. They said, "Why are you blocking us?" So we looked it up and they gave us a little bit of context. They didn't tell us the name of the company for privacy reasons. They felt like they weren't going to do that, but they did tell us it was a healthcare services company. We looked at the transcript and it said something, it was your typical courier scam. It said something about, "This is FedEx and we need you to pay $50 because your package is lost," or some nonsense like that. So based on the context and knowing that the number wasn't owned by FedEx, in that case it was a really easy one to discern it was a bad guy, just based on the nonsense that they had in the transcript. And by the way, we use NLP to do to transcribe from the audio to text transcript. So once again, we were able to remediate this very quickly, at least from the perspective of letting them know that it was a spoof call. Fortunately, spoof calls are very ephemeral. They don't happen for very long. This was ongoing for literally minutes. We work with our customer who worked with their customer to let them know what was happening, to let them know why they're having such poor call answer rates. They may have used a different number as a near-term remediation. But the net though is that the spoofing stopped, and then we could clear the number and make it go back to good because we were aware of what was going on. So sadly, spoofing is still happening. Again, another use case is the optimization for onboarding that I mentioned earlier. For your info, part of what's involved here is we have a dashboard where for your registered numbers, your watch list per se, you can actually see what, if any, unwanted robocalls are associated with those numbers. And so you would see, for example, that one I was mentioning a moment ago about the bank not using the valid callback number, that would actually show up here because we would put that in as an unlawful call, and as soon as it goes away, we would remove it. But by and large, you would only see problematic transcripts here. So that would mean something that's considered extremely spammy or fraudulent or unlawful for other reasons. So I kind of went through that as quickly as I could because I know I'm standing between you and dinner. But that's all I've got for prepared information here. The rest of it you can really peruse at your leisure, because it's really talking a little bit about things like the difference between event and content-based analytics, and just a little bit of background about UMail and what we do and how you can contact me later. So I'd like to stop sharing and open it up to Q&A at this time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerry.